flesh. How's this for an opening line? Did you know that Nietzsche died of syphilis?
How do you spell zucchini?
Z-U-C-H-I-N-I. No, Nietzsche's too obscure. How about, did you know that Shakespeare died of syphilis? No, she probably knows it isn't true. I don't know what to say.
It's not what you say.
Ever wonder how a king's party could literally change the course of history, one agonizing step at a time?
It sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? But yeah, sometimes history turns on these unexpected moments.
Welcome to the Time Cabinet, where we delve into those forgotten corners of history. Because honestly, who really needs another podcast telling you how to optimize your morning routine? Am I right?
Huh. Right. We're aiming for something a bit different.
Exactly. And today, we're not just talking about some abstract medical concept. We're talking about fear, blame, and that very human instinct to understand the things that scare us.
That's key. The emotional reaction is just as important as the disease itself in this story.
Totally. Ever felt like you were carrying a secret, something you wouldn't want shouted from the rooftops? This story has echoes of that universal feeling, you know? Just amplified across centuries and continents.
Magnified enormously, yeah.
We've sifted through historical accounts, some pretty wild ones actually, and groundbreaking scientific discoveries to bring you a multifaceted look at what was once called the most mysterious and most shameful of afflictions.
Those terms, mysterious, shameful, they really tell you a lot about the mindset at the time, don't they? The sheer anxiety it caused.
Definitely. So our goal today, let's try to cut through the centuries of myths, the superstitions, all that stuff, and reveal the surprisingly compelling and, yeah, at times, deeply unsettling truth about syphilis and its profound impact.
Patient tested positive for syphilis, right?
Is this some sort of recap?
But why did he test positive for syphilis?
Oh, I know this.
Either one, he has syphilis,
I was going to say that.
or two, the test was wrong twice, or three, he gave us someone else's blood.
Sounds like a plan. Where should we start? The mystery origin.
Okay, let's dive right into that mysterious origin story. Because it's not like some medieval epidemiologist was tracking patient zero with a handy spreadsheet, right? The beginnings are still a bit of a historical whodunit.
Precisely. The most widely accepted explanation, generally, is the American hypothesis. It points towards Christopher Columbus's voyages.
Right, the Columbus connection.
The timeline certainly lines up pretty neatly. His crew landed in Haiti in, what was it, January 1493?
Yeah, early 93.
And just days after they returned to Barcelona, you see physicians starting to document this strange, previously unseen ailment. They actually called it the Indian disease.
Ah, the Indian disease. So the idea is Columbus's sailors just picked it up in the Americas and brought it back. Kind of convenient for the Europeans, wasn't it? Not our fault.
Well, yeah, you can imagine that sentiment. It certainly shifts the blame, doesn't it? But it is the dominant theory based on the timing and the descriptions of this new disease appearing right then.
But were there other ideas? Like, could it have been lurking in Europe before? Maybe less nasty?
That's a crucial question. And yeah, there are debates. Some historians suggest maybe a less virulent form existed earlier. But the explosion of this severe illness right after 1493, that's strong evidence for something new, or at least a newly aggressive strain arriving.
Okay, so a new player enters the game, which leads us straight to King Charles VIII of France.
Right. His rather ambitious military campaign towards Constantinople with that little side trip to Naples.
Not so little. His army was massive, wasn't it? Nearly 40,000 men.
Huge. Practically a moving city. And that concentration of people is, well, it's significant.
So he takes Naples, and then what? Time to celebrate.
Oh, absolutely. 2 solid months of festivities. We're talking extravagant banquets, wine flowing freely, a general atmosphere of, well, victory and release.
Right. Contemporary accounts even mention the king's favorite, Leonora, making quite an entrance at one feast, apparently. Not wearing much.
Yes. It paints quite a picture of the atmosphere, doesn't it? A sort of celebratory decadence.
You can just picture it. Now, add in all those soldiers, thousands of them, mingling with the locals, and, let's be frank, the women of ill repute who would have flocked to a victorious army camp.
You've got the perfect storm, a biological mixing bowl on an unprecedented scale for a new sexually transmitted pathogen.
Exactly. The historical records show the disease just ripping through the army ranks incredibly quickly.
It spread like wildfire within the camp.
And then, maybe not the smartest move, the French army beats a hasty retreat. They basically just dispersed this new plague across Italy.
Pretty much. It wasn't just soldiers anymore. It hit all levels of society. Peasants, nobles, even reached the Pope himself.
Imagine being the Pope's physician then. How do you explain that?
Huh. Well, it certainly caused immense societal fear. You started hearing these wild rumors. Maybe it was airborne. Maybe you could get it from holy water.
Anything to avoid the obvious, maybe? Or to protect the church's image?
Probably a bit of both. It shows the desperation and the lack of understanding. You saw clergy suddenly preaching strict celibacy, ladies of the night in Paris apparently running for cover in convents.
Wow. Real social panic.
Absolutely. And then the final step. Charles VIII disbands his army. All these infected mercenaries, they head home. To Germany, Switzerland, all over Europe.
Turning a local Italian outbreak into a full-blown European pandemic.
Precisely. A textbook example of how quickly things could spread even then.
So why was it so bad right at the start? You mentioned virulence.
Yeah, the thinking is, scientifically, that when a pathogen jumps to a new host population in this case, humans in Europe who hadn't encountered this specific strain before, it hasn't co-evolved. There's no established balance.
Like introducing rabbits to Australia. No natural predators.
Sort of, yeah. The pathogen hasn't learned not to kill its host too quickly because that's ultimately bad for the pathogen too. So initial outbreaks of new diseases are often much more severe, with higher mortality and really dramatic symptoms. This lack of co-adaptation is likely why early syphilis was so devastating.
Makes sense. And then, of course, the blame game.
It's all over, Joe. They say I'm crazy. Fuck up. They say I may have syphilis, too. They say I've got delusions of grandeur.
Classic human response.
Oh, immediately. Everyone pointed fingers. It was the French disease in Italy, the Neapolitan disease in France, the German disease elsewhere, even the Christian disease in Ottoman lands.
Nobody wanted it named after them. Tells you something about us, doesn't it? How we deal with fear.
Absolutely. Externalizing blame is a coping mechanism. We see it again and again with epidemics throughout history. You also got other names like the Great Pox to distinguish it from smallpox, or venereal pox, even Cupid's disease.
The Cupid's disease. It's a bit romantic for something so nasty.
I suppose. It reflects the perceived link to love or sex. But the name that stuck, syphilis, didn't actually appear until 1530.
1530. How did that happen?
It came from a Latin poem by an Italian physician and poet, Girolamo Fracastoro. He wrote about a mythical shepherd named Syphilis who supposedly angered the god Apollo, or sometimes Venus, and was punished with this disease.
So we got the name from a poem about an angry god and a shepherd. Weird.
History is full of weird twists. But giving it a specific name, maybe that helped people feel they could grasp it, define it, even if they couldn't cure it yet.
Okay, so from murky origins and finger-pointing, we get to the disease itself. And that progression, it sounds truly awful, starts with the painless chancre.
Yeah, that initial sore, the chancre. It's often painless. And worse, it can disappear completely on its own after a few weeks.
So you think, phew, dodged a bullet, or it wasn't serious.
Exactly. It's incredibly deceptive. But the bacteria are still there, multiplying. Then comes a secondary stage, weeks or months later.
And that's when it gets really unpleasant.
Oh, yeah. Fever, feeling generally weak and awful, headaches, swollen lymph nodes, and then the rash, often a full-body rash, sometimes on the palms and soles, too, which is quite distinctive. And crucially, this stage is highly contagious.
Okay, that sounds bad enough, but then there's the tertiary stage.
That's the one that causes the really devastating long-term damage, potentially years or even decades later if untreated. We're talking about serious damage to internal organs, the heart, blood vessels, brain, nerves.
The descriptions from the time, those facial deformities, especially the nose collapsing, the gummas, those rubbery lesions.
Yes, the gummas could destroy tissue, bone, leading to things like saddle nose. And neurosyphilis affecting the brain and nervous system could cause paralysis, blindness, deafness, severe personality changes, dementia, just a truly grim outcome.
You can understand why people might have seen it as, like, divine punishment. It's so destructive.
Yeah.
Did all this visible suffering shake people's faith in the authorities, like the church?
It certainly seems to have contributed to a sense of crisis. When established powers, medical and religious, seemed helpless against this terrifying new plague, it created a kind of vacuum. People became more open to questioning things, maybe looking for alternative explanations or leadership.
And the descriptions of brothels just carrying on, despite the risks. Was it desperation? Ignorance?
Probably a mix. Economic necessity for the women, maybe a degree of fatalism or denial among clients. Machiavelli even wrote an account around 1509, I think, of encountering a woman horrifically ravaged by the disease. It gives you this really stark, visceral image. That level of suffering had to impact how people viewed the world and the powers that governed it.
Which feeds into those bigger social and cultural shifts you mentioned. Like, is it really plausible that syphilis played a role in something as huge as the Protestant Reformation?
Well, it's definitely not the sole cause, obviously, but think about the timing. Martin Luther nails his theses in 1517. Europe is already reeling from decades of this terrifying, seemingly unstoppable disease that the established church can't explain or cure effectively.
So it creates fertile ground for challenging authority.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
widespread anxiety, the questioning of why this is happening, the perceived failures of the institution, it could certainly have made people more receptive to Luther's message challenging the church's power and doctrines.
That's fascinating. And you also see shifts in, like, everyday life, morals, even fashion.
Yeah, there seems to have been a move towards perhaps more ascetic morals, a stronger emphasis on family, fidelity, maybe a reaction against the perceived link between promiscuity and the disease. And fashion-wise, clothing became generally darker, more closed off, higher necklines, longer sleeves. Some interpret that as a reflection of a more somber mood or even an attempt to conceal early signs of the illness.
Covering up, literally. And then there's the practical
Oh.
side. Early condoms.
Yes. Again, driven by necessity. In the 16th century, you start seeing mentions like from Gabriele Falloppio describing linen sheaths, possibly soaked in chemicals, designed to protect against the French disease, as he called it.
Linen sheaths. Wow. And wasn't there something about Henry VIII's physician and animal intestines?
Er,
Or is that legend?
The details are a bit murky, and the origin of the word condom itself is debated. But the idea of a barrier method specifically for disease prevention seems to emerge strongly in this period, a direct response to the syphilis pandemic.
Human ingenuity in the face of fear, right? Which eventually leads us to the actual science, but it took ages.
Centuries. It wasn't until the early 20th century, 1905 to be exact, that the actual causative agent was finally identified.
And enter Fritz Chaudin. But wasn't there some drama? Someone else claiming they found it first?
Yes, exactly. A researcher named Siegel had claimed to find the cause, but it turned out to be incorrect. The pressure was actually on Chaudin, who was a protostologist studying single-celled organisms, to disprove Siegel's claim for the health ministry.
So he wasn't even initially looking for the syphilis bug.
Not directly, no, but he was meticulous. Working with Eric Hoffman, a dermatologist, they started examining fluid from patients' chancres. Crucially, they looked at unstained samples using a special dark field microscope.
Why unstained?
Because the standard staining methods actually killed or destroyed these particular bacteria. By looking at fresh, unstained samples with the right lighting, Chaudin saw them. These faint, thin, spiral-shaped bacteria, he called them Spirochaeta pallida, the pale spiral.
The pale, spiraling microbe. It fits the disease somehow. That moment of seeing them must have been incredible, just adjusting the light on the microscope.
A huge breakthrough. They confirmed it by finding the same Spirochetes in other syphilis patients in the primary stage. They presented their findings, explained the proper way to visualize these elusive bacteria, and finally, the true cause was known.
Though the name later changed to Treponema pallidum.
Right. But even knowing the cause, the bacterium's ability to hide, to go dormant in that latent stage still made it tricky. Which brings us to the, let's call them creative early treatment attempts.
Oh boy, here we go. Mercury, right? That was the big one for centuries. Why Mercury?
Bizarrely, it was partly based on astrology. Mercury, the planet and the god, was associated with certain bodily functions and diseases. Paracelsus, a famous physician, championed it in the 16th century. The idea was like cures-like, somehow.
So they'd rub mercury ointment on people.
Ointments, pills, even fumigation, basically sweating people in mercury vapor. These ointments were often mixed with things like lard, turpentine, sometimes even weirder stuff, depending on the recipe.
That sounds incredibly toxic.
It was incredibly toxic. Mercury poisoning was rampant. People lost teeth, lost hair, suffered kidney damage, neurological problems. Often the cure was genuinely worse, or at least as bad as the disease's progression.
Yet people did it. Desperation.
Utter desperation. And the alternatives weren't much better. You hear about sweat baths using lead, drinking ant broth, putting earthworm plasters on sores, even applying dissected live chicks.
Live chicks. Serious.
Seriously. It shows the complete lack of understanding and the willingness to try anything. There was also pyrotherapy deliberately inducing high fevers. often by giving the patient malaria.
Inducing malaria? Why on earth?
Because they observed that Treponema pallidum is sensitive to heat. High fevers could sometimes kill the bacteria or slow them down, but obviously giving someone malaria is incredibly dangerous in itself. A really risky gamble.
But again, the social pressure, avoiding the shame of dying from syphilis or being disfigured by it must have been immense.
Absolutely. Which also explains the rise of concealing accessories, those fake noses made of metal or wax, elaborate wigs to hide hair loss or scalp lesions, bandages, even very early, crude attempts at skin grafting to repair facial damage.
People went to extraordinary lengths. It really highlights the social horror of it all.
Yeah.
Until then, a glimmer of actual hope.
Yes, finally. The turn of the 20th century again. Thanks to a generous donation from Franziska Speyer, a research institute was set up for Paul Ehrlich in 1906.
Ehrlich, the magic bullet guy.
Oh.
He'd already won a Nobel, right?
He had, for work on immunity, he had this revolutionary idea, finding a chemical, a magic bullet, that would specifically target and kill a pathogen without harming the patient's own cells.
A targeted drug. Sounds obvious now, but radical then.
Completely. His initial work at the new institute was actually focused on trypanosomes, the parasites causing sleeping sickness. He and his team synthesized hundreds of arsenic compounds, testing each one.
Arsenic? Doesn't sound much safer than mercury.
Well, the idea was to find a form of arsenic that was toxic to the microbe but less toxic to the human. It was a fine line. They found that compound 606 showed promise against trypanosomes.
Compound 606. Okay, so how did that connect to syphilis?
That was the brilliant leap. Ehrlich knew that the newly discovered Spirochaeta pallida was somewhat similar to trypanosomes. He had compound 606 retested, specifically against the syphilis spirochaete, by his colleague Sahachiro Hata. It worked. It was highly effective in animal models. Compound 606, which Ehrlich named salvarsan, meaning saving arsenic, was released in 1910.
The first real targeted treatment for syphilis, that must have been world-changing.
It was a massive breakthrough, the first effective chemotherapy, really. But it wasn't perfect. Salvarsan was still arsenic-based. It was difficult to prepare correctly, had to be injected intravenously, which was tricky then, and could have serious side effects, even fatalities if done wrong.
So not quite the perfect magic bullet yet. Did Ehrlich face criticism?
Oh, huge backlash. Accusations of profiteering, debates about its safety, the usual resistance to something new and paradigm shifting, but he kept working.
And developed something better.
Yes, they developed compound 914, neosalvarsan, which was less toxic and easier to administer. Ehrlich sadly died in 1915, but salvarsan, in its forms, remained the primary treatment for decades.
Until the next big revolution.
Exactly. Penicillin. Discovered by Fleming, developed by Florey and Chain, when penicillin became widely available in the 1940s, it was truly transformative for syphilis treatment, highly effective and much, much safer than the arsenic compounds.
Finally, a real cure. So you think case closed, syphilis eradicated?
You would hope so. Penicillin is incredibly effective, especially in the early stages, but eradication has proven really difficult.
Why is that, if we have the cure?
It comes back to that early detection and treatment. Because of the lingering stigma, that shame we talked about earlier, people are often reluctant to get tested or seek treatment promptly, especially if their symptoms seem minor or disappear initially.
So the disease continues to spread silently.
Precisely. Public health campaigns are crucial, raising awareness, encouraging testing. Some places, like the former Soviet Union, even implemented mandatory screening, which did reduce rates significantly for a time. But it requires constant vigilance.
And haven't we actually seen a resurgence recently?
Sadly, yes. Since the mid-1990s, after decades of decline, syphilis rates have been climbing again in many parts of the world. It's a stark reminder that even with effective treatments, controlling infectious diseases requires ongoing effort, education, and breaking down social barriers to care.
Wow. So who knew a king's party foul in Naples could ripple out like that? Global panic, scientific breakthroughs, changing fashion. It really makes you think about the totally unexpected consequences of things, doesn't it?
The interconnectedness is amazing and often unsettling.
From that mysterious Indian disease shrouded in fear and blame to an infection we can actually diagnose and treat effectively, the whole story of syphilis is just this powerful lesson in our vulnerability, but also our incredible persistence in trying to understand and fight back.
A very human story, ultimately.
Yeah. Maybe next time you're considering overindulging at a party, just spare a thought for the long, weird, painful history of unintended consequences, courtesy of King Charles VIII and his crew.
Huh. A sobering thought indeed.
Seriously, though, considering how incredibly long it took to figure this medical mystery out,
Hmm.
what other unseen forces, what hidden connections might be shaping our world right now that we just don't grasp yet? Makes you wonder.
It definitely does. There's always more to uncover.
So what part of this deep dive surprised you the most? Or maybe made you think? We'd love to hear from you. Head over to our social media, just search for the Time Cabinet, and drop us a comment.
Yeah, let us know your thoughts. We're always curious about what sparks your curiosity.
And hey, if you've bumped into any other historical oddities or tangled tales you think we should unravel, definitely let us know. The past is packed with surprises, and believe me, we are just getting started.